Good evening, everyone. It's good to have you all here this evening. As mentioned last night, Melissa and I have been looking forward to this opportunity for quite some time. And I understand that we are competing against some big, huge art fair in town, and then there's a hoopla basketball tournament of some kind, which is to say there are other places you could have been this evening, but you chose to come here. I'm flattered by that, and I hope I do not disappoint. It's great that we live in a country that we're able to worship God as we do, to come together on occasions like this, to study His Word and to try to get closer to Him, to gain a deeper appreciation for what He has done for us and how we can repay in some small way the kindness that He has shown to us. To begin our study for this weekend, I'm going to read a poem that was written by a young Lutheran minister shortly before he was executed in the closing days of World War II. Speaking of Dietrich Bonhoeffer, you may have heard of him. Bonhoeffer was arrested on the charge of treason, put into prison, and when it was obvious that Germany was going to lose the war, Hitler ordered that Bonhoeffer and a number of other people be executed by hanging. Bonhoeffer knew the fate that awaited him, and shortly before he died, he wrote this little poem entitled, "Who Am I?" And it goes like this. This is actually just a portion of a larger composition, but this one section reads, "Who am I? This or the other? Am I one person today and tomorrow another? Am I both at once? A hypocrite before others and before myself, a contemptible, woebegone weakling? Or is it something in me still like a beaten army, fleeing in disorder from victory already achieved? Who am I? They mock me, these lonely questions of mine. Whoever I am, thou knowest, O God, I am thine." Who am I? What Bonhoeffer was grasping at in those words is the same struggle that we are all engaged in our own personal lives. We are a complicated mixture of passions and dreams and motivations, fears. And just like Bonhoeffer, we struggle to understand who we are. Now, when you look at, for example, Hollywood celebrities, they are more than happy to tell you who they are. In fact, usually what they are doing is they're faking it. They try to put forward this persona that they're the beautiful people. They're the ones that have it all together. In fact, you'll often hear this statement that some of them will make, "I am who I am, you just have to deal with it. You have to accept me for who I am." And yet, when you look at their private lives, which actually are not all that private, and you see all the addictions that they struggle with and the revolving door of marriages, it's obvious they cannot deal with themselves. They try to put forth this idea that they have a ready grasp of who they are and their place in this world, and it's obvious they don't. They're struggling with the same question that the rest of us are struggling with, and that is, who am I? We toil in obscurity, and as Bonhoeffer said in that line in his poem, we are mocked by these lonely questions. Who am I? Why am I here? Why am I the way I am? Often weak, inconsistent. Am I really being the authentic self, or am I, as Bonhoeffer feared, am I being something of a hypocrite sometimes? If people really knew who I was on the inside, would they admire what they see, or would they hate me for it? And so most of us tend to go through life struggling with those kinds of questions. And if we are honest with ourselves, we may not like some of the things that we see within ourselves and about ourselves. And so, again, it brings up a whole new level of questions. How can I change? How can I get out of this rut that I'm in and move on to a higher plane of level or meaning in my life? And that brings us then to the topic of this weekend study, the subject of understanding myself. Is it even possible to gain a true understanding of the authentic me, who I am? To recognize both my strengths and my weaknesses, to see a path toward making the kind of changes that I know I need to make in my life. So what we're going to do this evening is first examine this question of why am I the way I am? And actually that's not going to take very long. We're going to dig a little deeper than that and understand a nagging, perplexing problem that all of us have to struggle with, and that's the subject, of course, of selfishness. So let's start this evening by looking at this passage in Ephesians chapter 2, the first 3 verses. Paul lays out for us a rather neat summary of why we are the way we are. If you've ever struggled with that question, why am I the way I am? Well, Paul answers it for us right here in these 3 verses. He writes, you he made alive who were dead in trespasses and sins, in which you once walked according to the course of this world, according to the prince of the power of the air, the spirit who now works in the sons of disobedience, among whom also we all once conducted ourselves in the lusts of our flesh, fulfilling the desires of the flesh and of the mind, and were by nature children of wrath, just as the others. Now you'll notice that this passage I have on the screen, I have several words highlighted in a different color. Because in those highlighted phrases, Paul identifies the 3 dominant influences that make us who we are. And when we go through this and explain it all, you're just going to slap your head and say, well, of course, this makes perfect sense. We can look at our own lives and recognize exactly what Paul is saying in these verses. Let's start with that first one. He speaks of the course of this world. This is Paul referring to what we'll call the environmental influences. These are the external pressures that from the day we are born we are exposed to. And they have a profound influence on who we are. In the early days, of course, it will be our parents or guardians. Our siblings might have a role to play in this. And then there's a larger circle of influence as we grow older. There are the friends that we have, the teachers in our schools, the kind of entertainment that we choose to enjoy, the books that we read. Today, a huge influence, external influence in our lives is, of course, the internet. And we're exposed to just this flood of information coming at us from every direction of all kinds of varying qualities. Frankly, most of it bad. And we're kidding ourselves if we don't think any of this has any effect on us. Of course it does. It has a huge impact on us. Again, from the day we are born, we're exposed to a world of sin and degradation and corruption and foolishness. It just pounds us constantly. We marinate in this soup of corruption, what he calls the course of this world, according to the prince of the power of the air, the spirit who now works in the sons of disobedience. But he goes on to talk about we conducting ourselves in the lust of our flesh, fulfilling the desires of the flesh and of the mind. Here Paul is referring to what we'll call the internal influences. That is, as human beings, as creatures of flesh, we have desires, we have passions, we have appetites. He uses the word lust here. That word kind of has a negative connotation in our minds, but it's not necessarily bad. Being animals, as it were, occupying physical bodies, we have these appetites, and these things are not inherently evil. Here's the problem, though. They recognize no boundaries. They acknowledge no limitations. And if we allow these appetites and passions to just do whatever they want, well, we've seen how that turns out in the lives of a lot of people, haven't we? They live like animals because there are no inhibitions, no restraints on their behaviors. Whatever the desires of the flesh, the desires of the mind that they feel, they just come out with it. They live their lives that way, and Paul says that's the way most of us live. Well, let's just be honest here. That's the way all of us live to some extent or another. How many times in your life now, I don't care how hard you have tried to serve the Lord, how many times have you looked back on something that just happened and you just think, what was I thinking? Why did I do that? And you know why you did it. Because there was some urge that welled up inside and you failed to control it. And it got you in trouble. We all recognize that tendency. So this is a second major influence that combines with the first to make us the kind of people, creatures that we are. But Paul adds a third element here that requires a little bit of explanation. He says, we were by nature children of wrath just as the others. Now, the Calvinist reads this and says, oh, well, there's the explanation right there. We're born sinners. We're born tainted by Adam's sin, and there's just nothing we can do about it. That's not what Paul is saying here. You know, we use an expression quite often among ourselves today. When we say that we do something by second nature, what do we mean by that? We mean that it's a habit. It's something that we have done so many times for so long that we don't even think about it anymore. We have, especially on the tail end of these first two, the environmental influences and pressures that are constantly working on us, pulling us in a certain direction, and these internal urges and feelings and passions, those things are welling up from the inside, and together, somewhere along the way, we start making decisions and choices about how we deal with the frustrations in life, how we manage our relationships with other people, the worldview that we have as to how we interpret the world that we live in and react to it. In all of this, we just develop certain habitual ways of responding to the environment, the world that we live in. And we start doing things by second nature. We don't even think about it anymore. And that's what Paul calls, by nature, we're children of wrath. We're just kind of stuck in a rut. We're set in our ways. Hopefully good, but frankly, most of the time bad. And it's extremely difficult to just break out of that. In fact, it's so difficult that the Lord had to send His Son to this earth to die for us, to rescue us from our own stupidity. Okay, so now we have covered in these three verses, Paul has laid out for us why we are the way we are. It'd be very easy at this point to just say, okay, I can collect my check and go home now. I've explained to you why you are the way you are. Why? Who am I? Well, I've told you. Paul's told us here. Of course, there's a lot more to this story. It's going to take the rest of the weekend to unravel. And that's why we're going to proceed further then in this study. We're going to, in the first three lessons in this series, tonight, tomorrow night, and then the first lesson on Sunday morning, we're going to be looking at some of the habits of the heart and behavior that get us in trouble, the things that harm us and harm the people around us. That part of ourselves, in other words, that we don't like. That part of ourselves that we are ashamed of. We need to spend some time understanding these problems that we're struggling with, which is really just an expansion of what this outline that Paul has laid out for us here in Ephesians 2. And so once we go through those three lessons and gain a deeper understanding of why we're in the mess that we're in, then the last two lessons, Sunday morning and then Sunday night, we're going to look at how we can fix this problem. How we can gain a better understanding of not just who we are, but how we can fix what is broken. Not by ourselves, obviously with the Lord's help. But it's something that is a path, a means toward getting to a state where we can fully not only understand ourselves, but recognize the path forward. And what we're going to do this evening is look at the subject of selfishness. Now, selfishness is just simply a single word that we would use to describe what Paul just outlined for us in Ephesians chapter 2. All of these influences, all of these urges or appetites, and the bad habits that we've developed, all of this can really be summarized in a life or an attitude even of selfishness. It's all about me. If you have a Bible handy, I would encourage you to turn to Luke chapter 12. We're going to use as the foundation for the remainder of our lesson this morning the story of the rich fool, a parable that Jesus spoke on one occasion. Luke chapter 12, I'm going to begin reading in verse 13. Then one from the crowd said to him, "Teacher, tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me." But he said to him, "Man, who made me a judge or an arbitrator over you?" And he said to them, "Take heed and beware of covetousness, for one's life does not consist in the abundance of the things he possesses." Then he spoke a parable to them, saying, "The ground of a certain rich man yielded plentifully. And he thought within himself, saying, 'What shall I do, since I have no room to store my crops?' So he said, 'I will do this. I will pull down my barns and build greater, and there I will store all my crops and my goods. And I will say to my soul, Soul, you have many goods laid up for many years. Take your ease, eat, drink, and be merry.' But God said to him, 'Fool, this night your soul will be required of you. Then whose will those things be which you have provided?'" Jesus is responding to an individual who came to him, and in all honesty and respect, the man felt like Jesus was qualified to arbitrate in this inheritance dispute, and he asked Jesus to intervene. And Jesus shrugged that off. He said, "I didn't come here to straighten out all your personal problems." He said, there's a deeper issue in play here. And that's why he then said, "Take heed and beware of covetousness." This man needed to recognize he had his focus on something that it didn't really need to be focused on. He's ignoring some much bigger issues in his life. And this parable of the rich fool is the means by which Jesus is trying to tell not just this one man, but all of those who would listen to him to wake up and look at what is really important in life. The first clue, as we analyze the story of the rich fool here, is all of the pronouns that this man uses to describe himself. You notice how many times in here he refers to I, or me, or my, or mine. What's the common element in all of those references? It's all about self. This man's primary concern in life was about himself. What he could do to please himself, to advance himself, to make himself more important, or to feel better. By making himself the center of his world, this man set himself up for three serious mistakes. We're going to look at those three here shortly. The first mistake that he set himself up for was that he was blind to the transitory nature of this life. Did you notice in verse 19 where he said he'd have all these goods laid up for many years to come? What's the assumption there? He sees no end to his life. Many years to come. That's way, I don't have to worry about that. I've got many years now to enjoy all of this life that I have created for myself now. he is blind to how short his life really was. As it turns out in this parable, he had less than 24 hours to live. And then who shall these things be? You see, all the worldly interests that this man had centered his attention on just did not account for the brevity of life, for the uncertainty of life, the fact that he did not know when he was going to die. He just assumed that he was going to be able to enjoy all these things for many years to come. He did not have that guarantee. And folks, neither do you or I. We don't know how much time the Lord will give us here upon this old earth. But how many times do we, like this rich fool, tend to make our plans and arrange our activities and our personal affairs as though we will live for many years to come? We don't know that. And it's very foolish for us to think like that. This man lost sight of the fact that his life was very brief, very short, very uncertain. A second mistake that this man made was that he had a very distorted sense of what was important in life. This man obviously had no concern about what was going on outside the walls of his estate, however large it was. Instead, his concern was, in the first part of verse 19, eat, drink, and be merry. Now, who's that going to benefit? Himself, obviously. You see where his mind is at? All he's concerned about is himself, making himself feel good and happy and prosperous. He was focused on the sensual, on the material things of this world. And what lay beyond this life? If you were to ask the man, are you going to die someday? He'd say, oh, yeah, sure, I will someday, many years off in the future. Well, what lies beyond that? Well, I don't know. I'll deal with that at some point. He has no thought about what lies beyond death. What is important in life to him is the here and now. What pleases my selfish self right now. And that's all he's going to deal with or concern himself with. And that brings us to the fourth serious mistake that this man made, and that is he was ignorant of the real source of his prosperity. Now, look again at what this man said about his circumstances. Where in his language here do you read any reference to anybody else and the good that his wealth could do for these other people who were in need? He never mentions them. How many times do you read in his words any reference to God? God is completely absent. God is absent from this man's words because he's absent from his head, from his heart. He just is not thinking about God. It's my barns, my crops, my goods in verse 18. That's all he's concerned about. There is no appreciation. There's no gratitude in this man's heart for the one who has blessed him with all of these things. From a human standpoint, others might look at this man in his gated community and say, this man is successful. This man has arrived. He has achieved so much. And people would look up to him. But what did Jesus call him? A fool. And that's why he's a rich fool. Because whereas on some level he yes, has achieved so much, has accumulated so much for himself, he has served himself so well that he's lost sight of what life is really about. He's a fool. He doesn't see the whole picture. This, of course, illustrates, a wonderful illustration of the role of selfishness in the entire history of the human race. Go back to the very beginning, the Garden of Eden. Do you remember what tripped up Eve? And Satan dangled the forbidden fruit in front of her. The text says that she saw that fruit was good to eat. It was pleasant to the eyes and is desirable to make one wise? What's the standard by which she is measuring whether or not she ought to take a bite of that fruit? It's how it impacted her. It's selfishness again. When God confronted Adam in the Garden of Eden after he ate of the forbidden fruit, and God, points an accusing finger at Adam and says, "What have you done?" What did Adam do? He threw his wife under the bus. "Well, that woman that you gave me, she did this and that." So, it's not my fault. Who's he protecting here? Himself. How many times do we play that same kind of blame game? Because we're only concerned about ourselves and our interests in trying to protect ourselves. When you look throughout history, throughout the Bible, you see numerous references to the fact that selfishness drives all of our social ills. It destroys marriages and families. It wrecks friendships. It blows up churches. It poisons our politics and our institutions. It undermines whole societies. And like the rich fool, we're blind to it. In Isaiah chapter 56 and verse 11, Isaiah spoke of the leaders of the nation of Judah, and he called them shepherds who cannot understand. They all look to their own way, everyone for his own gain. Well, if all they're looking for is their own personal interest, how effective a job do you think they're being in leading the people who need guidance from them? They're not doing it, because selfishness has blinded the leaders to the work that they need to do. In Jeremiah chapter 16 and verse 12, Jeremiah says, or God says through Jeremiah, "Each one follows the dictates of his own evil heart, so that no one listens to me." I can't think of another passage anywhere in the Bible that more accurately captures the spirit of the age in which we live now. Each one follows the dictates of his own evil heart, so that no one listens to me. God's been kicked to the curb. People aren't interested in God. They're not interested in really one another. About the only thing they're interested in is themselves. In 2 Timothy chapter 3, verses 2 through 4, Paul speaks of a time when men will be lovers of themselves, lovers of money, boasters, proud, blasphemers, disobedient to parents, unthankful, unholy, unloving, unforgiving, slanderers, without self-control, brutal, despisers of good, traitors, headstrong, haughty, lovers of pleasure rather than lovers of God. Do you want that kind of people as your next door neighbor? Did you notice what headed the list? What's the very first item that he had on the list? All of these antisocial behaviors that Paul is warning about, the first item on the list is really the foundation of all the rest of them. Men will be lovers of themselves. There's the reason that societies go into the ditch. When large numbers of people in a society start looking to themselves and their interests and their needs and their wants and their desires and start focusing on that, and other people and their needs, well, I'm not concerned about that. God definitely is out of the picture. I'm not concerned about him, but it's all about me. We become lovers of ourselves, and this is the kind of society that you end up with. So that raises, I think, an important question here that we want to finish out this study on, and that is, okay, how can I identify this kind of spirit, this kind of selfishness in myself? I want to suggest 3 simple questions that we can pose to ourselves to get some sense of whether or not selfishness is a problem in our lives. Now, if I were to poll the group here, good folks I know, and I include myself in this number, are you a selfish person? I think most of us would, the hand would kind of, well, I hope not, because I'm trying to serve the Lord and do the right thing. And I'll grant you that, because I'll be honest with you, I have to recognize I struggle with that myself. But here are 3 tests that I have found very helpful to me, and I hope they'll be helpful to you. And these are not the only 3, by the way. We could extend this list down quite a bit further, but these are 3 just handy means by which you can kind of hold yourself up in the mirror and see how you rate in this question of selfishness controlling your life. First question, first test. How do I use my resources? I'm speaking here of my finances, my time, my skills. How do I use my resources? Let's break this down. How much of my resources do I spend on myself, as opposed to spending those resources helping other people or doing the Lord's work, something besides myself? How much of myself do I pour out in behalf of other people? Money, time, skill, effort, whatever it might be. Now, I can't answer that question for you, obviously. This is something that you're going to have to answer, but be honest with yourself. When you just look at the full scope of your life and all of your time and the money that you have access to and all of that, how much of it is spent on making life comfortable for yourself, as opposed to trying to reach out and help other people and help the Lord? Now let that sink in. Paul said in Acts 20 and verse 35, quoting Jesus, it's more blessed to give than to receive. And we love to quote that verse because it just sounds so pleasant, so beautiful. Wouldn't it be nice if the whole world operated on that principle? Well, let's forget the whole world. Let's talk about you. Let's talk about me. Is my life characterized by giving to other people? Or by getting as much as I can? Serving myself. Am I a lover of myself? Or am I a lover of other people and the Lord's work and trying to spread God's influence in the world around me? How am I using my resources? Test number one. Test number two. What do I talk about in my conversations with others? You think, what? Look at what Solomon said in Proverbs 18, verse 2. A fool has no delight in understanding, but in expressing his own heart. If in your conversations with other people, you just can't wait to turn the conversation to yourself, your work, your family, your kids, your grandkids, your hobbies, your problems, your health issues, your work, all the things that involve you and your life, you just love to talk about you. And if the conversation tends to kind of veer off into somebody else and their issues and their life and what's going on in their life, well, that's not as interesting as what's going on in my life, and I try to steer the conversation back to me. Now, put on your thinking cap and figure out what's going on here. Why do I like to talk about myself? Maybe I'm selfish? Now, let's be realistic here. I know when somebody comes up to you and says, "How are you doing today?" Or "What did you do this afternoon?" It's perfectly legitimate to answer the question. You're going to be talking a little bit about yourself and your activities. But you're not stuck on it. You're not consumed by letting everybody else know how your life is going and your affairs are going. Here's another version of that question. How interested am I in the life and the affairs of the person that I'm talking to? If somebody comes to me and they have some issues, some problems, some burden that they're carrying, and they try to unload that burden on me, am I really genuinely interested and want to help? Or do I have the attitude, they're wasting my time, I don't want to fool with that? Where's my heart? This is a very simple test, but it's one, the simplicity of it is such that we tend to overlook it. Just monitor your own conversations with other people. How much of your conversations are about you and your life versus how much is about them. Now, if everybody walks out of the building this evening and nobody talks to each other because you don't want to talk about yourselves, we kind of miss the point here. But you see what I'm saying? Keep conversations about yourself to a minimum. Try to show more interest in other people and what's going on in their lives. And then there's a third simple test that we can apply. Again, this is not the only one. We could extend this list on out, but you kind of get the drift of where we're going here. The third test that you can apply is, how easy is it for me to admit that I am wrong? How easy is it for me to admit that I messed up? Again, Solomon says in Proverbs 12 and verse 15, the way of a fool is right in his own eyes, but he who heeds counsel is wise. It's the fool who says, I haven't done anything wrong. It wasn't me, it was the other person. They're the one that was at fault here. You know, if everybody else just did things the way that I think they ought to be done, this world would just be so much better. And I just resent it when somebody comes to me and they want to tell me that I need to straighten up my act, and they're the ones that have the bigger problem, you know. Right there, we tend to see a clue as to whether or not selfishness plays a role in our lives. Is it difficult for us to admit wrong? Now, let's be honest. I think we'll all say, well, yeah, I know I'm not perfect. I make mistakes from time to time. Okay, when you make a mistake, does the phrase, I'm sorry, just kind of get stuck right down here in your throat? You just can't get it out? Because you know your pride's going to take a huge hit when it comes out. How easy is it for you to go up to somebody when, upon reflection, you recognize that I said or done something that has hurt or offended them in some way? How difficult is it for you to go up to that person and say, without qualification, look, I blew it, I'm sorry, I shouldn't have said what I said, I apologize. No qualifications, just come out and admit I made a mistake and apologize for it. Is that hard for you to do? Because if you just can't bring yourself to do it, you're protecting somebody. You're hiding the truth about somebody, a truth that needs to come out and be dealt with. And you know who that somebody is that you're trying to protect. Yourself. That's selfishness. See where we're going with this line of questioning here? These are very simple little tests that just, you could apply them several times a day for most of us, but they serve to help us just stop and reflect and think, do I have a selfishness problem? And maybe you're thinking, okay, I just don't have that many mistakes for me to admit that I mess up. If that's the case, you need to be here Sunday morning when we talk about self-deception. We all have things we need to apologize for. We all have relations around us, people in our lives that we need to be involved in their lives, being a source of help and aid and comfort to them. All of us have opportunities to use our resources to help others. Are we doing it? Simple test to help us identify the presence of selfishness in our lives. Let's go back to our text in Luke chapter 12. Remember in verse 15, Jesus introduced the parable of the rich fool with this statement: one's life does not consist in the abundance of the things he possesses. In other words, who I am and my purpose in life is not defined by how comfortable a life I can create for myself, which in our very prosperous American society tends to be what most of us are consumed with. How do you think Jesus spent his time in this life? How many times do you suppose Jesus posed the question, who am I? Why am I here? I'm just struggling with these questions and trying to find my place in life. Did Jesus ever ask those kind of questions? No. In fact, when you read the Gospel of John, it's obvious that Jesus knew exactly who he was, and he knew exactly why he was here. How many times did he say something like, I am the good shepherd. I am the light of the world. I am the true vine. I am the bread of life. I am the way, the truth, and the life. And moreover, he said, I have come that they might have life and have it more abundantly. Who was he thinking about? What was his life about? You see, Jesus had a crystal clear conception of why he was here, what his purpose was, and what he had to do. That purpose was not fulfilled by chasing money or titles or power or pleasure. That purpose was achieved by serving others. And he died not as a rich fool, but as a poor and infinitely wise man who knew who he was. And friends, that's a challenge that he has left for you and me. Let's open our eyes to the real purpose for which God put us here upon this earth and get busy in that work, reflecting the kind of life that he lived, because that's what he would have us to do. Let's go to God in prayer. Father, we're so very thankful that you've given us this story of the rich fool to open our eyes to what our purpose in life is, to recognize how easy it is to be distracted by the things of this world, to have these influences, both internal and external, draw our attention away from you and the purpose for which you'd have us to commit our lives. Father, we recognize that we have a selfishness problem to one extent or another. It's so difficult for us to pull our attention away from the affairs of this life, this world, and the material existence that surrounds us, and to reflect upon the greater purpose for which you have placed us here. And we ask, Father, for the wisdom that we need to be able to see the opportunities that come our way, to serve you, to serve our fellow man, to have our lives be instruments in your hands to accomplish your work and glorify your name. So thankful for your Son Jesus, for the perfect example of unselfishness that he provided us, and help us to constantly look to him for the inspiration that we need to align our lives with your will. All this we ask in Christ's name. Amen.